Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we have developing news in the northern section of the front line in the direction of Kharkiv. The Russians have managed to capture the northern parts of Vovchansk, leaving the Ukrainians with no presence in the northern section of it, and with their very wide control over the Severodonetsk River's northern bank, it is likely that the Russians will enter a new stage in the fighting here in the northern section of the front line. Either they will use this to regroup, consolidate their gains, and start further offensive operations both to the east, west, and south, where they will cross the river line and push through the eastern and western parts along the forest lines and the river lines to improve their positions and expand their control over the area, where the objective here would be to expand the offensive operation into a larger operation, where the Russians will be looking to gain full control over the highway connecting the eastern and western parts of the Kharkiv region by the Russian border. This would allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in the southern direction towards the Oskar River line and down towards Izium. This would be a significant development here in the Kharkiv section of the front line. This could also be a moment where the Russians have consolidated their gains and strengthened their positions here in the north, which would allow the Russians to start the new section of their offensive, which would be to launch further similar operations as the one in Kharkiv in the Sumy or Chernihiv regions, or both of them, where they would be expanding the front line, improve their positions, and expand their control over areas. The objective of the Russians in this operation is to relocate Ukrainian forces from the eastern and southern parts of the front line to weaken the Ukrainian defenses in the areas and spread out their forces to the northern part as well. This means that the Russian Kharkiv offensive has so far been very successful in that sense. However, there is a lot more that needs to be done for the Russians to completely succeed with such an operation, and that is to expand the front line further, to expand the line of contact, making the Ukrainians spread out their forces even more, and this will allow the Russians to further weaken the Ukrainian defensive positions. The reason for this is that this very wide front that the Russians has opened here north of Vovchansk is now all aligned with forest areas or river lines. This means that it is very difficult for either side to advance. The Ukrainians have relocated a lot of forces to Vovchansk and the surrounding area. Just this section here, the Ukrainian forces number over 10,000 compared to around 2,000 to 5,000 Russian soldiers. That means that the Ukrainians outnumber them with either 2 to 5 times as many soldiers, but the Russian firepower allows them to hold on to their positions and pressure the Ukrainians, as well as the Ukrainians being on the move, which has allowed the Russians to hit them while they are deploying, which gives the Russians a significant advantage in the artillery front. We see that the Russians have pressured the Ukrainians significantly in the direction of Vovchansk and Lipsy. However, the Ukrainians, with the gathering of forces, have been able to halt the Russian offensive, considerably slowing it down to the point where the Russians now have captured the northern parts of Vovchansk, but have not expanded in the west or east, and in the direction of Lipsy there has been no territorial changes. This indicates that the Russians have slowed down as they do not have the necessary forces to pressure onwards. This indicates that one of two things will happen. The Russians will consolidate their gains and then increase the amount of troops they have to restart the offensive operations and push the Ukrainians further back towards Kharkiv, to force the Ukrainians to send even more troops in the Kharkiv direction, or to open a new front where they will expand in the direction of Sumy and Chernihiv, where the operations will increase and the line of contact will expand. At the same time, the Russians are continuing their offensive operations in the south and east. In the direction of Chasiv, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the micro-district in the eastern parts of the city. This has allowed the Russians to take up positions in the high-rise buildings, and as previously mentioned, these high-rise apartment complexes allowed the Russians to actually hold positions and take control of this foothold. The foothold that the Russians have gained is allowing them to pressure the Ukrainian positions within the micro-district and start storming operations in the direction of the Ukrainian positions within it. There is this footage here which shows that the Russians are indeed within the residential area of the micro-district. This means the Russians have captured the forest line and open field here to the east of it, and has allowed the Russians to gain close to it, gaining access to the apartment complexes. This marks the beginning of the Russians storming the microdistrict and attempting to gain control of it. This is combined with the Russian efforts in the northern parts in the direction of Kalinia, where they have started offensive operations there, expanding their zone of control north of Vovchansk and to the west of it. The Russian objective here is to gain full control over the canal line east of Chasiv, as they've also started storming operations and assault operations here to the southeast of Chasiv towards the main parts of the city across the canal. This means that the Russians are continuing offensive operations here in the direction of Chasiv and have made some advances that allows them to start the next operation here in the direction of Chasiv, and that is storming the Chasiv microdistrict, as well as gaining full control over the canal line before crossing over and storming Chasiv itself. Further south here in the direction of Klischiivka, the Russians have made a significant advance to the southern parts of the town. We see that in this geolocated footage here, which shows Russian soldiers active in the southern parts of the town. This means that the Russians have made a significant advance within the town itself, from the northern outskirts to the southern outskirts, and the Russians will likely capture it soon. The Russian capture of Klischiivka will allow them to flank the Ukrainian positions here to the south, and then push in a western direction towards the canal line. This will allow the Russians to gain control over the southern flank of Ivanivske and significantly expanding the zone of control by the canal line, reducing the required units to hold their defensive positions in the southern flank of Bakhmut and start further offensive operations across the canal here west of Klischiivka into these open fields which are less defended, and start pushing towards the Pushki, Perechine and Konstantinivka itself. This could mark the start of the battle across the canal line and the start of the battle towards the main parts of Chasiv. It will also allow the Russians to relocate forces to the northern parts towards Ryhorivka, Kalinia and other villages here in the northern flank of Bakhmut. To give an overview over today's update and the current situation, the Russians are continuing the offensive operations in the north, capturing the northern bank of the Vovcha River near Vovchansk and the surrounding areas. The Russians have not advanced here in the direction of Lipsy, but heavy fighting continues as the Ukrainians attempt to counterattack and the Russians try to push to gain a foothold within the town. Further south in the direction of the Klischiivka area, the Russians are pushing towards Berestove, Pishane, and the western parts of Tabaivka to expand the zone of control and start offensive operations in that direction. There's also positional fighting south of Ivanivka. Further south in the direction of Bakhmut, Chasiv, the Russians are storming the micro-district, gaining a foothold and pushing onwards to gain control over it, pushing towards Kalinia, gaining a foothold there as well. And to the south, the Russians have stormed Klischiivka, capturing the majority of the town, and this will likely expand their offensive operations in the southern flank of Bakhmut. Further south in the direction of Ocheretine, positional fighting has continued west of Avdiivka throughout this month, with recent days seeing the operations slowing down as the Russians are focusing on the northern parts and seeing how that develops before developing the offensive operations here. But positional fighting has allowed the Russians to capture the majority of Umanske, Netailove, and push in the direction of Novopokrovsk and Novoalexandrivka. Further south, the Russians managed to lose Nevelske, but close majority of the fortified areas south of Pervomaiske. In the direction of Krasnodarivka, the Russians captured the apartment complexes to the east of the city, leaving a small bit contested, as the Russians have captured a majority of the fortifications east of the city and north of the city, as the Russians are launching a flanking maneuver in the northern direction. The Russians have also managed to capture the western parts and central parts of the city, leaving the northern and northwestern parts remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians have captured the majority of Ryhorivka and are pushing towards gaining the front line along the river line south of Krasnodarivka to strengthen the southern flank. Further south, the Russians have gained a foothold in Pereskovivka and pushed southwest of Novomikhailivka towards Konstantinivka and the road between it and Vuhledar. In a western direction towards Urashina and Seremayovsk, the Russians stormed both of these villages and have managed to gain a foothold in both of them, and positional fighting is taking place within them. In the western direction towards Smerfopil, the Russians have captured the Dacha area and are now very close to Hulyaipole. Further west, the Russians have captured the majority of Robotine and the fortified areas to the southeast of the village, leaving only the northern fortifications under Ukrainian control. In the direction of Krinki, the Ukrainians have expanded their zone of control slightly as they continue the operations here despite the Russian offensive in the north. And with this, we see that the Russians continue offensive operations all across the front, where they are attempting to push the Ukrainians out of the south and gaining an advantage in the north as they continue their operations in the east and the south. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.